Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Owner's Box After Dark. I'm your host, Mark Farinella, and this is episode 56 of our video podcast, and it's a very special one. This is a Mansfield Memories podcast, and it'll be the first that we've done here on the video platform. You know, I'm 70 years old. My good friend Alex Salaki is 70 years old, and we both spent most of our formative years in this community. And we've seen it change over that time. I mean, he's been a teacher, I've been a local journalist. We both put down roots here after the roots that were already there for us to begin with. And now we're looking at the past and seeing how much of our little old town has changed over these years. And it's changed a lot. I think of certain things every now and then that are much different than they were back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The first thing I think of maybe sometimes is food. You know, I mean, let's face it. When I was growing up, the big supermarket hadn't really been invented yet. So we went to local grocery stores, local butchers, local convenience stores, and they were all small, but you knew the people who run them, and you got to know their families, and you supported them because that was what you did and part of a community. Now, I think about these days, if you want to get, say, some fresh meat or something like that, well, you'll show up at a supermarket like this, and you get your pound of hamburger, and you'll go home and fry it up on the grill and probably burn it to a crisp. Or you could go to one of the few remaining local butcher shops, which was called Fresh Catch on Chauncey Street here in Mansfield, and I bought some yesterday, and it was delicious, and yes, I did burn it on my grill. I just can't cook. Another thing I think of sometimes is gasoline. Now, in my last episode, which was on the audio platform, I talked about all the car dealers in Mansfield. When we were growing up, there were car dealers from every American manufacturer in this town. Now, that was, again, before the big influx of foreign cars. And those have kind of disappeared over the years. Now, here we are today. We have 8 gasoline stations, very similar to the pumper here where I am here. This pumper is on South Main Street near the Xfinity Center. When I was growing up, there were as many as 23 retail gasoline locations in this small town that only had maybe 5,000 people in it when I was born, and probably 9,000 when I graduated from high school in 1971. And so I decided to take a look back at how service at a service station changed all those years. So Alex and I put together this episode. Much of it is our recollections, and some of it was from research off of sites like the old Mansfield News Archives or a couple of books that have been published about our hometown. But much of it's our memories, and you know what? As we get older, we want to keep those memories. So I hope you enjoy this episode. We have pictures of many of these old gas stations or the folks who ran the butcher shops, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Thanks so much, and let's go. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Owner's Box. And this is a very special edition of our podcast. Both audio and video platforms, and we hope you'll enjoy it. My guest is Alexander Salaki, my brother from another mother, a fellow who I've known since 4th grade, and Mansfield graduate, and like I do, he shares a love of our town's past. And as a result, we do these episodes called Mansfield Memories. Our first one was episode 50, and now we're a little bit farther down the road. We have a new one to come. Now, in the first one we did, Alex covered the numerous barbershops that were located in our hometown back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, back around that time. And I chose the many car dealerships that existed here in the town back in that same period of time. And right now, Alex has chosen another thing that really is very important to folks of the Italian persuasion, as most of this town was when we were growing up. Alex will take a look at where we got our food, especially the butcher shops. And believe me, I miss them. I miss the ones that I used to go to. The food that we could make from that was incredible. Alex, Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, there could be a little bit of a learning curve here. I might give you some information about meat that you never knew. Uh, but I just want to talk about the places, the buildings, the people that we used to spend our time with when it was time to pick up some food. Nowadays people are used to going to the larger grocery stores like Shaw's and Stop and Shop and Big Y, or they go to the superstores like Target and Walmart, and some even throw in a membership club like BJ's and Costco. But back in the day, as Mark mentioned, when we were growing up back in the 60s, things were different. And a lot of the stores, a lot of the markets from that time period, now if they're still around now, and most of them aren't, are generally convenience stores, and people flock to the markets that are now in this town and in nearby towns. But like I said, in the 50s and the 60s, things were different. There were markets all over town. And if I describe to you what a typical Saturday was like for me, a member of a large family, uh, you can get an idea what it was like in Mansfield. Like on my typical Saturday, I'd be having breakfast, and my mother would sit down at the table next to me, and she'd have a couple of lists. And she'd say, "Here's the list for Saros, and here's the list for Marini's. Can you think you can swing by there and pick up these things?" And I, always say okay because I like to talk to the people that I'd see there. And then, of course, the phone would ring, and it would be one of my aunts. And she'd say, "Alexander, do you have some time to run down to Central Market and pick up an order that I just called in? Or here, why don't you take the items down just to make sure that you get everything right?" And so, okay, I'll take care of that. There was always some benefit for me to do this. I either get something to eat or I'd get a few bucks in my pocket or something like that. So I said, okay, no problem. And then the phone would ring again, and it would be another one of my aunts, and she'd say, "Xander, can you swing over to the A&P at some point today and pick up the some canned goods for me that I need for something I'm putting together?" So that was what my Saturday was like. Okay, I'd go up to Saros. Now Saros Market was run by Ralph Saros Sr. He initially started his business out of his car, and then he finally was able to get storefront, and it was a great butcher shop. There were great things in there: cold cuts, stuffed pork roast was one of the highlights. They were known for that stuffed pork roast, seasoned and stuffed pork roast. So I'd go up to Saros and I'd get the list filled there, and I'd talk with Ralph, and I'd talk with his sons, Ralph Jr. and Anthony, and I'd talk to Ralph's brother Joe, and it was always a fun time. A lot of good sports talk in there while the order was being filled. And then I'd head down to Marini's. My mother usually had a Saros list and a Marini's list. Now, Saros was a little bit up Oakland Street, right? Marini's was on North Main, down near the sporting goods store. It later became an art gallery and a theater. The MMAS Black Box Theater was there until they moved. And it was run by three brothers. Of course, their father, Mario Marini, had opened the store when he was a young man. And then three of his four sons took over the store. There was Paul Marini, Celestino Marini, and Silvio Marini. And they took over the store, and they were known for, coming up with some really well-trimmed cuts of beef. Usually there'd be something on the list that was, from that butcher shop that involved a roast or some steaks or something like that. They also had more canned goods and packaged goods in various aisles, more of closer to being the kind of supermarket that we are familiar with today. And it was always great talking with those guys. And then I'd have to fill the other lists that my aunts gave me. So I'd head down to the center of town, in the area of where Jimmy's Pub is right now, and across the street from the Elks Club, which used to be the post office. And I'd stop in there. It was Central Market, run by a guy named Angelo Lanari, but he was assisted by Tony Melchiori and Hugo Caparini. Now, Tony Melchiori later took over that place, and then he moved it down Central. What's that street? Villa Street.
Yeah.
To the IGA. He took over an IGA franchise.
They built that new. That was where the Central School used to stand.
Exactly. Yeah. Right on the site of the Central School, and Tony was a great friend of my family's, and it was always good to spend a little time talking to him. And this is when I can interject a little bit of familial history, because my uncle, a man named Albert Salaki, he ran the Armour meatpacking factory in the south end of Boston. And he had graduated from Mansfield High and moved out from Mansfield soon after and worked his way up in the meat industry in Boston. But he'd come back to Mansfield every weekend. He lived in Weymouth. He'd come back to Mansfield, and he was still close buddies with Ralph Saro and the Marini brothers, especially Paul was one of his really good friends, and Tony Melchiori. And so he'd meet with these guys, and they'd talk meat. And I learned so much about meat because he would bring me along. He said, come along with me and I'll get you a soda or something. So I'd take a walk with him, and we'd stop into Saro's or we'd stop into Marini's, and he'd have a little sheet of paper and he'd be writing things down with his pencil. And I know it took me years to figure it out that he was, providing them with some deals every once in a while on some good meats. But also, he told me, the key to a good piece of meat is how the fat is marbled, right? And it's just incredible because it's not something I would have ever thought about. I would just say, trim that fat off. But he said, well, here's some fat you want to leave, and here's some fat you want to trim off. And this is how you're going to get the best flavor out of this ribeye or this tenderloin or whatever. And he would be having this conversation with Tony Melchiori or Paul Marini or something like that. And I was just learning things about meat and how important the fat was, even in the cold cuts.
In a modern day sense, that's something that reason why everybody loves the Kobe beef from Japan is because it's bred to have a lot of marbling in all of its all throughout every cut. So that I can see where that information is something well known to you, and now the rest of the world is discovering it.
Yeah. Well, one time my uncle took me into the Armour plant where I could see how bologna and salami and hot dogs were made.
I'm surprised you ever wanted to eat them again.
Well, it took a while. It took a while till I could have a hot dog again. Okay. And then sometimes after I finished those errands, back to my Saturday, I'd have a list that had to be filled at the A&P, and that was run by a man named Gardner Alexander. And I never really spent much time in the meat section at the A&P. Usually my aunt, who wanted me to get things there, was looking for some canned goods or some packaged goods, which they had a plentiful supply of. But I have some memories of going in there, and Mark and a couple of my cousins have these same memories. You'd walk in, and the first thing you'd smell is 8 o'clock coffee.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because for some reason, a lot of the beans ended up on the floor somewhere.
Well, that was the A&P thing. They allowed you to ground your own coffee. They had a machine there. You'd attach the bag to it, and 90% of the people who used it always messed up on it. And so the coffee beans would go flying everywhere, and people would just stomp them into the floorboards. But yeah, that was an unmistakable scent.
Right, and there was also in front of the meat case there was an area of the hardwood floor that had there must have been a leak at some point where
or just decades of meat being served.
Yeah, and it smelled like meat right on the floor there.
It definitely did.
But that was a popular spot in Mansfield also. Um, and Also on a Saturday, occasionally, one of my aunts might have me heading up to Carbonetti's, which was up on North Main at what we would call the gateway to the North End, right by Angel Street and North Main. It was opened by Charles Carbonetti and later run by Hugo and Alfred. And one of my aunts preferred to get her cold cuts there. And also, because there wasn't much in the way of bakery goods available in Mansfield, and I'll talk more a little later about the Cosmopolitan Bakery, they had a pretty good layout of packaged breads and pastries as you entered Carbonetti's. There was also another market down on South Main called Findley's Market. I can't say that I ever went in there, but it must have had a loyal clientele because it did last for quite a while. It survived an electrical fire in 1955, and it always had big ads in the paper, front page ads, which I couldn't have been inexpensive. Uh, and Highlighting sales and specials at their market. So they must have had a very consistent clientele. They ended up closing in 1970. Uh, some of my friends who grew up down in that area remember it more as a place where they picked up some snacks. But it was a thriving meat market at one point back in the 50s and 60s. Okay. There were also some smaller places. I'll mention just a few. I mean, there were a lot of stores in town that were convenience stores back then. But there was DeMonte's up on Chauncey Street, uh, just in the area of where the current Buick dealership is, a little bit beyond that. It's the Mansfield Deli now. And DeMonte's was mainly a convenience store, but they did have some cold cuts and maybe a few steaks or chicken parts or whatever if you needed something in a pinch. And close by on Chauncey, again in the vicinity of where the Buick dealership is, was also Bronia's, similar type place to DeMonte's. I don't remember Bronia's being around much beyond the mid 60s, maybe. Um, It was around that time that, in the late 50s, the First National started to make some moves, located up at the Foxfield Plaza, which is now called something else. The Forbes Crossing Plaza, maybe, is the name of that location. And that introduced to Mansfield buyers, consumers, and introduced the idea of coupons and deep discount sales if you buy a certain amount of stuff, buy one, BOGO, that type of thing, which it wasn't called that back then, and other types of promotions that started to attract people. But most Mansfield residents, if my family's any indication, and Mark's family, stayed loyal to the local, let's say, mom and pop type operations that were trying to still make a go of things as a different type of climate was developing in the supermarket industry. Um, so that's probably about it for the markets in Mansfield that I used to go to back when I was a kid, just kind of on the fringe or on the cusp of the idea of the so-called supermarket arriving in our vicinity. Okay. One last thing I wanted to close with is that some of these places where we got our food back then weren't traditional brick and mortar buildings. Uh, there was only one bakery in Mansfield at that time. Mark's grandfather had run a bakery, but it was closed by then. And I'm talking about Cosmopolitan Bakery, which was right down next to Central Market. So there wasn't much availability throughout the town to pick up fresh bread and fresh pastries and that type of thing. There's a couple of companies, Cushman and I believe the other one was Liberty. They used to have trucks, and those trucks would come through town, and the back of the truck was like a small store with shelving on both sides, And that's when on Saturday afternoon, the Cushman truck would pull into our driveway, and I'd go out there with my own personal list. And I'd look at the bread, I'd look at the pizza dough, I'd look at some of the pastries, the whoopie pies, and I'd pick up some stuff from this guy named Sam Celia, who used to let me get right up in the truck and take a look at everything. And also there was the fish man. The fish man, the fish truck, came every Friday. And he went to the neighborhoods where he knew there were people that were going to pick up some haddock or some scrod or something like that. It was an ice truck, and it would hit those areas and sell fish to people because there was no fish market in town. Fresh catch didn't exist yet. So I just wanted to toss that into, there was some mobile shopping back in those days. And that's the way it was. That's the way it was back in those days in the 50s and 60s when Mark and I were growing up here in this little burg of Mansfield.
Alex, I can add some thoughts about this too, because it was something that left indelible imprints on you when you were growing up, I think. Now, remember, my mother was as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant as you can get. My dad met her in Jacksonville, Florida, and brought her up here, and she had to live with a bunch of screaming Italians for the rest of her life. But you know what? She got introduced to Sorrow's Market originally, and that's pretty much what we stayed loyal to for as long as they were open. And the one thing I always would remember, and some people might cringe at this, but because they got fresh meat from the people who provided it to them, you could walk in there, go to the butcher counter, and Ralph would be behind the counter and say, 1 pound of hamburger, the nice lean hamburger. So he'd grind it right there in front of you, put it on the paper, give it to you, and I'd go outside and take a shaker of salt and start gobbling this stuff off raw. Now, you spend big money for steak tartare in big restaurants, but you know what? That was the most delicious fresh meat you could ever get. And if you were a carnivore at heart, that will always remember. I'll always remember that. And I haven't been able to find anybody who does that since. I'd be afraid I'd get some sort of disease from it. Now, my mother would go to Carbonetti's for sweetbreads. Now, you know what sweetbreads are, right? It's pig brains.
Yeah.
And you'd fry those up, and I didn't like them. My dad didn't like them, but that was a Southern delicacy, and she was so happy that she could find somebody who would have sweetbreads around here. And so that was where we went to Carbonetti's.
So that's one thing I forgot to mention. One of my aunts liked to get her cold cuts at I did mention that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to add is that not every shop offered a cold cut, which is called head cheese.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
right?
Of course.
And that's one thing that she liked was to get a half a pound of head cheese, and that's getting Carbonetti's had it.
Now, I remember going to Central Market a lot when it was in the original building, the Wheeler building, which was then called the Oddfellows building. And Tony Melchior was always a great guy. Of course, we would always run into him down in North Falmouth as well, because they had a house down there as well later on.
Yeah.
And he was always a great guy. And I would go into the IGA after it was built, but that was probably because Linda Sarrazin was working at at one of the cash registers, and I was trying to date her at the time, and it did work out, so that was good. But he was always a friendly guy, and one of the people that kind of was really a cornerstone of Mansfield in those days. I still remember the First National. The First National building is now a hardware store. It was a True Value for a while. Now it's unbranded like that, but it's a thriving little hardware store where you might want to go to Home Depot for this or that and the other, but if you want something in a hurry and they know they have it, you just go into that store and I can get my painter's tape or stuff like that. And I'll get new keys made. I always can get new keys made there. But yeah, that was where the First National was. Alex, do you remember what happened after they moved into the Foxfield Plaza? What they tried to make that store into, that storefront? A restaurant called the Interlude Lounge.
Oh, that's right.
It was supposed to be.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be Mansfield's fine dining.
Yeah.
And it was a very weird place because when you'd walk in, because it no longer had the shelves or anything like that. This was a huge space. And so they had tables everywhere, but no separations, no little rooms or anything like that. So you felt like you were in the middle of the Oscars, because you'd have all these tables and all these people around you, and then people would be running food around. Food wasn't all that good. It didn't last very long. But yeah, I remember that. And of course, it was right next door to the Mansfield Five and Dime store, run by Morris Shribman, and everybody remembers him if you were our age. And of course, as you mentioned, the A&P, great memories from that place, which I lived next door to it. It was already closed by the time I moved into 10 Thomas Street. Remember, this was on the main drag in Mansfield originally. It was on what was then called Chauncey Street before the underpasses were built in town. So it got a lot of traffic as a major national chain of supermarkets. But as times changed and these stores had to move into larger areas, there was no place for A&P to move in Mansfield. And First National took care of that when they moved into their new store down at the Foxfield Plaza. So the A&P eventually went out of business. There were other stores, and there was a Cumberland Farms and all that, but I'll always remember the smells. And like you said, like of the coffee or of the meat. And you mentioned the Cosmopolitan Bakery. I think that the smell of fresh baked bread was incredible. It was something that I will never forget. They made Italian style rolls too, just like my grandmother did. And so when my grandmother cooked them, that was the same smell. Of course, as you mentioned, my grandfather ran a bakery when he first came over here from Italy. And so all these little memories are still there, but the stores that we went to are gone. And thank you for bringing them back to life briefly. So what we'll do is we'll take a little break here, and we'll go into the next part of this episode, which will be my recollections of another part of the automotive industry in a way, as I talked about the last time. We'll talk about the gas stations in this town. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Bob Miller of the Boston Bruins. When it comes to hockey, I'm a professional. And when it comes to feeding your family the highest quality foods at some of the best prices in town, you can't beat the finest. Their beef is always tender and juicy, and their fruits and vegetables are the freshest in town. How do I know all this about Finest? Easy. My mom's been a Finest shopper as long as I can remember, and she knows the pros. So come to the Finest and score with the pros.
It's the sad truth. Millions of cars lack spirit. And your car may be one of them. Now, Esso Research puts spirited performance into cars that have never delivered top power before. That's why thousands are switching to new Golden Esso Extra. The first gasoline specifically designed to make the most of today's new higher compression engines. Find out what your car can do with this new gasoline. Try a tank full of new Golden Esso Extra. It's the world's finest gasoline for any car. Thousands are finding its added power and mileage more than repays the small extra cost. And remember, famous Esso at regular price and super premium Esso Extra are still available. So you can pick the one that suits you and your car best. Choose from these 3 brilliant gasolines, topped by new Golden Esso Extra. Enjoy the full power and the spirit of happy motoring.
Welcome back to the podcast, and it's a very special one here. It's another episode of our Mansfield Memories. And, of course, Alex just talked about the butcher shops and the little convenience stores and even the 2 tiny supermarkets we had in our town. I'm going to go in a different direction, but it kind of ties in with what I talked about in our first my first Mansfield Memories episode. And that's the seeming overpopulation of gasoline stations that served Mansfield when it was a community of only about, I'd say between 5,000 and 9,000 residents when we were young, as opposed to the 25,000 residents mini city it's become in the 21st century. But first, if I may, a little personal tale that may explain this interest of mine. When I was a mere tyke, my parents and I took yearly vacations of 2 weeks in April to visit my mother's parents in their small hometown of Williston, Florida. It was a tiny community that time practically forgot when Interstate 75 carved a new path down the center of the peninsula. Once a bustling junction of U.S. routes 41 and 27 that provided services and lodging to weary southbound tourists for many generations, Williston had practically become a ghost town. by the time we got to the 1960s. Our family visits were little more than an opportunity for my mother to reconnect with her aging parents, but to me, they were 2 agonizingly boring weeks away from my friends and schoolmates. So almost every day, I would walk around that town and explore for hours, something that today's parents would never allow a preteen to do, I imagine. And one thing I like to explore more than anything else were the many gas stations that were located in Williston. Most of them sold very unfamiliar brands such as Standard, Phillips 66, Pure, Sinclair, and Marathon. I'd walk for hours around the town, armed with a pocket full of nickels, so I could stop at several of them and purchase ice-cold beverages from their vending machines to help me cope with the oppressive heat of a Central Florida springtime. Many of these gas stations closed during the time between when I first started my unsupervised strolls as an 8-year-old and when I stopped vacationing with my parents towards the end of the 1960s. But I'll always remember the brands and the tiled buildings and the smell of petroleum products and the taste of those ice-cold Cokes or Dr. Peppers that kept me walking. And each time I returned home, I realized that Mansfield had something in common with Williston in that it had plenty of gas stations of its own, although I didn't share the same fascination with them because I didn't have to walk aimlessly for hours to entertain myself in this town, as I did in Williston, of course. One inescapable fact is that, like the Williston of the mid-20th century, Mansfield had become a transportation hub for much of its modern existence, either from the railroad lines that brought industry to the town or the highways that converged here and served not only local residents, but also those heading elsewhere. Today, there are 8 gasoline stations in Mansfield, 5 of them in the same location or quite close to where they were originally located. We also have a set of Tesla superchargers at the Mansfield Crossing Shopping Center and a hydrogen fueling station at the Stop and Shop on Chauncey Street, which I don't believe anybody's ever used yet. Not too many hydrogen cars out there. There probably never will be because that's not what people are looking forward to in the new green future. But in my research from about 1950 to the present, I found at least 23 locations where retail gas pumps were located in Mansfield. Some of them were associated with car dealerships. Others were tiny standalones for the sale of gasoline only. And then, near the end of the 1950s, there was a construction boom that resulted in several modern stations that included full automotive services. Obviously, I don't have the time to go into depth about all of these during my segment, so I'm going to focus primarily upon a few that made a significant impact upon the town. First, I want to talk about the oldest stations still operating at their current locations, and I'll start in the middle of town at the corner of North Main and Chauncey Streets, where a modern Gulf station is located today. This station began its life as a retailing location for the Atlantic Refining Company. The plot of land on which it's located was created after the fire that destroyed the famed Tavern Hotel and the later extension of Chauncey Street eastbound in the mid-1950s that corresponded with the completion of the underpass beneath the Boston-Providence rail line. People our age remember that Atlantic with its red and white signage and bright white tiling on the buildings with red stripings and letters. They sponsored Red Sox baseball on the radio using the tagline, "Atlantic keeps your car on the go," and they sold Atlantic Imperial, the clean carburetor gasoline. Now, Mansfield stations had 2 full service bays and a set of pumps. 2 full sets of pumps, rather. One was accessible from North Main Street, and the other was from the Chauncey Street side. For many years, it was run by Arthur Pedini Sr., then by Joe Paquin, entering the 1970s, but that was followed by many rebrandings and ownership changes. First, upon the merger of Atlantic with the Richfield Oil Company of California, it became an ARCO station. When ARCO retreated its marketing area to the West Coast and Southwestern states, the station changed hands frequently, becoming a Shell station for much of the 1970s. Then it was briefly an Exxon station, and then it sold unbranded fuel for a while before its rebirth as a Gulf station in recent years. Another station virtually in the same location today is the Sunoco Pumper on Copeland Drive next to the Wendy's restaurant, but it's actually been relocated twice over the decades. Prior to the construction of the railroad underpass, there was a station on the southern side of Route 106, Russell McAuliffe's Texaco, located near Winthrop Street, within viewing distance of the multiple railways crossing Chauncey Street and Rumford Avenue farther to the east. Now, that station became a victim of the relocation of the Rumford River at the beginning of the underpass project, and it was never relocated. But another service station was right in the crosshairs of where the relocated train tracks would go. And it did not survive the construction, but it got a second life. Bob Aiken ran that Sunoco station located at 61 Chauncey Street, not far from today's Winthrop Avenue and very close to where the Jeep dealership is today. But Aiken had been a very successful retailer, and he had the blessings of the Sun Oil Company to relocate in Mansfield if a suitable location could be found. In 1956, the town rezoned land for business purposes along the new Copeland Drive, and Aiken's modern full-service station was opened in the summer of 1957. Not long after that, Al Soforenko of Norfolk took over operation of the station. It operated unchanged on that site for many years, but a few decades ago, in a move that was typical of gasoline companies' marketing trends of the time, the full-service station was knocked down, and a small convenience store was built in the midst of 3 pump islands that could accommodate 6 vehicles at a time. And that's still there today. Now, back on Chauncey Street, its intersection with Central Street once was called Payne's Corner, and that served for decades as the busy junction of routes 106 and 140. On the southeast side of that intersection, where the Carvalho and Signorello Insurance Company is located today, there was a tiny station. It was one of many in the town that sold the products of the former Standard Oil Company of New York, known progressively as Saucony, Mobil Gas, and now just Mobil. The station was owned by Floyd Tibbetts and was a popular stop for those headed to Foxborough from the south or to Norton from the other direction. But with the massive changes in Mansfield's traffic patterns in the 1950s, a number of factors worked against that tiny station's future. When Copeland Drive and its new underpass became the new path for Route 140, Central Street's grade crossing over the Boston Providence Railroad tracks was eliminated. But there was lots of land across the street at Payne's Corner, so a new modern mobile station was built there at the start of the 1960s. Under the ownership of Arlen Shaw for many years, the station had been renovated several times, and its number of pumps have multiplied to true pumper status, although there are still service bays at the site and state inspections are conducted there. Heading east on Route 106, at the corner of Hope Street today, stands a modern Canaan fuel station, recently rebuilt after a tragic fire that claimed the life of one of its longtime service bay mechanics. But in 1947, brothers Hugo and Tony Copperini opened what the Mansfield News described as a trim and modern full-service station selling the City Service brand. For those of you unfamiliar with that brand, that's the predecessor of what is today Citgo, a well-known brand that still sponsors that giant neon sign beyond the left field wall at Fenway Park in Boston. Hugo's son, Ted, took over operation of the station in the 1960s, and it briefly operated as a Getty station after City Service changed its branding and started divesting itself of stations within New England. But even after it became an outlet for the independent Canaan Fuels brand, it still offers mechanic services and continues to do so today in its brand new building. One of the oldest service station locations in town is on South Main Street opposite the South Common. That houses multiple Citgo pumps as well as a convenience store and a Dunkin' Donuts kiosk. It opened in 1966 as a 3-bay Shell station in a very familiar architectural style that was used by newly built Shell stations of that era in all 50 states. First, it was under the ownership of Link Holsky, then Edward Hyde, and later Irwin Kamen, and it was a fixture on that corner for many years before rebranding and renovation resulted in the current Citgo station. Prior to the 1966 station, Shell products were sold from a much smaller building at that corner, and prior to that, from a small station on Crocker Street near the North Common. Many years before that, probably about 90 years ago, there was a storefront that was barely set back from the South Common Four Corners area. It was called C.E. O'Malley's General Store. In the early days of gasoline retailing, multiple brands were often sold at one site, and old photos of O'Malley's store revealed old-fashioned, manually filled Texaco and Mobil gas pumps, as well as other long-forgotten brands. That location also served Mansfield's earliest motorists by selling the Dayton brand of tires. As I said at the start, there are other gas stations that have come and gone in Mansfield over the years, and here are a few that were significant in their day but are long forgotten. In the late 1950s, during a boom in the Mansfield gasoline business, a modern station was built at the new intersection of Copeland Drive and Chauncey Street. Originally carrying the Calso brand for the Standard Oil Company of California, a national rebranding brought the Chevron brand to town. And it would remain there for about 15 years. Originally managed by Peter Holsky and later by Tony Ivoroni, Bill Bechtel, and Sam Holland, that station boasted pumps on both sides of the intersection, a two-bay service area that was expanded in size not long after its initial construction, and it had U-Haul rental services as well. It operated profitably for many years, but the 1974 gasoline crisis and Chevron's gradual retrenchment from the New England market spelled doom for the location. But the site wasn't inactive for long. A gentleman named Richard Bowen, who founded the Honeydew chain of coffee shops in a small North Main Street storefront in 1973, needed a larger location for his growing business in Mansfield. So the former Chevron gas station became an expanded Honeydew location, and it remains that today. At the beginning of this report, I mentioned the strange brands I discovered in my long-ago vacations to Florida. My favorite was Phillips 66, probably because the founding company named the gasoline brand after the famed Mother Road, US 66, which was also the inspiration for my favorite television show of the 1960s, Route 66. The tale of two young men crisscrossing the country in a brand new Corvette, seeking love and adventure wherever that car brought them. Boy, I tell you, that was an inspiration for me. And that had the greatest theme song in the world by Nelson Riddle. And I still play that in my car when I drive places. So imagine my joy when, in the midst of a drive to expand to all 50 states, Phillips Petroleum opened a brand new station in Mansfield in 1963. Built from scratch on the Chauncey Street extension next to the manufacturer's National Bank building, which is today a Bank of America, the station featured a triangular roof over the pumps that was standard for all the new Phillips 66 stations of the time. The station was first managed by Dick Galanti and then Russ Holsky, but business never really took off, and the station closed and reopened several times before 1971, when new owners basically abandoned it. Large advertisements seeking new ownership ran in the Mansfield News for nearly 6 months, but eventually the station was just shuttered, and the land was purchased by one of the successive owners of the bank that, as I said, is now a Bank of America location. The gas station's location was eventually converted into a drive-through banking kiosk, and nothing remains of its presence today. The Phillips 66 brand is still going strong, however. There are some stations that can still be found in the Northeast, but since a merger created the ConocoPhillips Corporation a few years ago, the brand has become a solid fixture in the South, Midwest, Mountain States, and the Southwest. And that's likely to expand even more with the recently announced absorption of the Marathon brand. Now, back in the late 1960s, regular gasoline usually cost anywhere from 25 to 29 cents a gallon. That may sound amazing compared to today's prices, but adjusted for inflation, 29 cents a gallon then translates to about $3.15 a gallon today, and that's not too far off from today's price. A little lower, but not too far off. Also, salaries were much lower, and the average Chevy Bel Air or Ford Fairlane probably got about 15 miles a gallon. All that being said, people were always looking for bargains and hoping to save a penny or two, and that's what Mansfieldians got at Eddie Carl Station on South Main Street. Carl sold unbranded gas, and that was purchased directly from petroleum suppliers and sold at a discount, whether it's from Mobil, Exxon, Shell, BP, or wherever. Gasoline is basically gasoline, and it doesn't become a specific brand until a particular retailer adds all of its proprietary additives and marks up the price. Now, Eddie Carl was able to sell his gas at maybe 2 to 4 cents lower a gallon than the branded stations, and it was every bit as good as theirs because any one of them could have refined it in the first place. In retrospect, I chuckle how my dad would load me into the 56 Chevy to fill up at Eddie Carl's, then head into Norton, and we'd eat pints of soft-serve ice cream at a shop called the Creamy Freeze, thus immediately consuming whatever savings my dad had realized at the gas pumps. Carl's gas station and fuel oil business eventually closed, and new houses sprung up in the mid 1960s around the curve on Route 140 where it was. And included in those houses was a new one for my Uncle Charlie and his family. And then the state came calling and plowed the new Interstate 495 through that area on its way to Cape Cod. It's now a bustling area with a superhighway, the Xfinity Center, a new hotel, and several commercial buildings, and there's no hint at all that it was once the remote location of a small shack and a couple of gas pumps that offered a small bargain to the consumers of a bygone era. There were a lot of other gasoline retailers in Mansfield that I can recall from at least the past 60 years, and I'll recap them quickly by brand. I mentioned the Mobil station at Chauncey and Central Street, and that was just one of 4 Mobil stops that I can recall. Metrano Chevrolet on Pratt Street had retail pumps for a while, as did Old Colony Motors on West Street, just around the corner from where I grew up. And also selling Mobil was Bonnie's General Store at the East Mansfield Common back when Route 106 followed the winding East Street into Easton and beyond. Today, Mansfield's newest Mobil station, and one of only 2 in town, is the Big Pumper near the entrance to the Xfinity Center on South Main. Back on East Street, where the buildings that house Cousins Pizza and Bristol Liquors now stand, there was a small store that had 2 Esso pumps. Esso, of course, was the original branding of Exxon and part of the original Standard Oil monopoly, and it continues to be a proud brand in Canada and worldwide, as well as a partner with Mobil since the 2 companies' merger in 1999. In addition to Hugo City Service on Hope Street, that brand was also sold at Savini Pontiac on South Main Street, and also at a small station on School Street near where the current intersection is for the latest 140 bypass. That station closed before I was born in 1954. The former Oldsmobile dealership across from Sandy's and next to the old fire station in the middle of the town was called Mansfield Motors, and they originally sold the products of the Tidewater Oil Company under the Tidal brand. That became the Flying A brand in the 1950s, and long after that dealership closed, most of those stations sold Getty gasoline. And here's something you may not know. The original owner of ESPN, the sports broadcasting giant, was Getty Oil. Vickery Motors on South Main Street, the town's Chrysler dealer for many years, sold the Boston-based Jenny brand at its pumps in the mid-1960s. And when City Service acquired Jenny's assets, Vickery closed its retail pumps for good. Gulf has had a prominent presence in town today, but in the 1950s, a very small station owned by the Cataloni family stood at the corner of Pratt and North Main in the north end of town, across from where Geno's is located today, and that was Jack's Cafe for many years, for those of you who are a little older. The company also delivered fuel oil, so after the underpass construction, the entire business relocated to the other side of North Main Street, and that's where a new apartment building stands today. In addition to its large heating oil storage tanks, the station featured 2 very difficult to access Gulf gasoline pumps until its closure in the 1970s. Today's Mansfield residents can still fill up their cars with ease and convenience at any of the 8 existing stations, the ones I previously mentioned as legacies from earlier times, as well as the new Mobil pumper on South Main, the Stop and Shop on Chauncey Street to the west of Route 140, and the Cumberland Farms in the middle of the business district next to the current Gulf station. But while there may be plenty of convenience today, I still can't help but think that even with nearly 3 times as many stations in Mansfield in the middle of the 20th century, the quest to fill one's tank with gasoline was certainly a little bit more of an adventure in those days. Alex, where'd you get your gas when you were young?
Well, I know this podcast is about Mansfield, but there was this place in Foxborough, right down Central Street. You went by Foxfield Plaza, and you entered Foxborough.
The Tri-S, right?
And it was, and one time I think it might have been called Old Colony Gas or something along those lines.
I think you're right.
And they did give S&H green stamps there. And my father became a fan there. And then when I got my license, that's where I used to go to get my gas. And there was this guy that worked there constantly, right? And one time he said to me, he said, "You remind me of a guy who comes in here a lot." He said, "You look just like him, and he drives real slow, and you drive real slow too." Right? I said, "That's my father." And so I kept going there. Now there's a couple of condos there. I think.
Yeah. Funny that you had mentioned that because I too used to go out of town to get my gas. You might recall there was an American station, Amoco, at the corner of 106 and 152 in Plainville. The Fernandes supermarket was on the right, and the old Wilkins Airport was on the other side of the road, which all that has changed a lot. But that American station used to have the best price, and it was the only place around here where you could self-serve in the 1970s. So I'd pile into the little Volkswagen, put 10 gallons into the tank for $3, and I would be able to drive that thing around for 300 miles on that.
Wow.
So that was, so I didn't give business to my own hometown. I probably should have.
I do remember, I had forgotten some of those names, but I remember that Phillips 66. I guess just because of the connection to Route 66 and the TV show and all that, I wanted that place to last.
That is a popular brand elsewhere. But it's funny. I did find one in Connecticut not that long ago, and I think when I took the trip to Newtown to watch Mansfield in a basketball tournament, I did stop at a Phillips 66 station just for the memories.
But I had forgotten names like Flying A and Jenny.
Yep.
Those
This town had gas lease stations up the yin-yang. So we'll be right back after a quick break, and we'll wrap this episode up. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be right back.
Texaco presents Miss Ethel Merman.
Trust is a must at Texaco. Trust is a must, we know.
You wanna be able to always rely
On the gasoline, motor oil, and products you buy. In everything that we do at Texaco, we're working to keep your trust. Wherever you go at Texaco, trust is a must. So for products you can trust, come on everybody, let's hear it. You can trust your car to the man who wears the star, the big bright Texaco star.
Welcome back to our Mansfield Memories episode. I, of course, am Mark Farinella, and Alex Salaki is my co-host today, and we've had a lot of fun going back into history a little bit to think about the butcher shops where we used to go to get our meat, and the gas stations where we didn't go, I guess, but they were all over town where we knew to keep our cars running, and maybe a bit of a bygone era, but you know what? It's still present in our memories, and thank God we still have our memories, right, Alex?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, great memories.
So we'll probably come up with another set of memories at some point. In a few months, maybe we'll come back and do this again. You got any ideas?
Oh, I've got plenty of ideas, but we'd have to talk and judge whether or not it might be something that people are interested in. And I think last time we did one of these, we did mention that if there's anything that you could add as a listener, and maybe a person who lived through some of the same stuff we did, if there's anything we could add, please send a comment along at the owner's box.
I can give you those addresses right now. The email address is theownersbox2020@gmail.com. TheOwnersBox2020. No punctuation, no spaces, nothing. That's one big line at gmail.com. Or you can send me a letter on snail mail to the Owner's Box, Post Office Box 272, Mansfield, Massachusetts, 02048. And you will be able to get a hold of me. Now, just remember, folks, my audio podcast is available on almost all of the major podcasting platforms: Apple, Odyssey, Amazon's new service. I forgot what it's called, but it's out there. iHeartRadio, Spotify. You can find me anywhere. Just search for The Owner's Box with Mark Farinella, and you'll find it. And of course, these video podcasts are available on YouTube. And again, just search for it. You'll find them. You'll find all of my episodes, and they're all there. So I want to thank my my good friend Alexander Solaki, who's always been known to me first as Xanda. Glad you mentioned that. I wasn't going to.
Well, that's what my aunt still calls. Well, she would still.
Yes,
call him.
yes, I would imagine. So anyway, Alex, always helpful, not only in this sense, but in our basketball broadcast. Of course, he and I both do the Mansfield High School and King Philip Regional High School boys and girls basketball games on your local cable channel. So watch us on those and search for our archives. You can watch some of those. Hello, everybody. Mark Farinella here. Different glasses, different shirt, same great taste. I just wanted to mention to everyone that, first of all, thank you so much for all of the responses we've been getting on this podcast when we released the audio version. We've had plenty of responses on Facebook and on the website itself. Thank you so much for that, and please keep it coming. In fact, here's an example of one that I wanted to make sure I got this out to you. It's a little bit of maybe a correction or a clarification of the timeline regarding the Arco station, or the Atlantic station, at the corner of North Main and Chauncey Streets in Mansfield. And it came from Chris Paquin, who's the son of one of the owners of it. Chris wrote me to say that his uncle Joe was the first one to have ownership after Arthur Padini Sr., and that was about 1966 or 67. And then his father, Bob, ran the station for quite a few years, and then it was sold to Leon Grant around 1978 or 79, somewhere around there. And then, of course, the Arco switch had started back in the early 1970s, and I remember when they put up the blue signs and they redid the station a little bit. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of the new style for the station, which had it looked like a spotlight or a glowing light at the top of the station, which told you it was like a beacon to say, "Come and get our gasoline." So, lots of thanks to Chris for that. And as Alex mentioned during the course of the podcast that we recorded, we welcome all feedback. If you have any things that maybe we have missed, or that maybe we just didn't know that had happened, or maybe we got it wrong a little bit, or maybe if we were just right and you liked it, let us know. We really enjoy that. So thanks again for watching this episode of The Owner's Box After Dark. Oh, come on, I got to do it. I haven't done it in a long time here. Hang on. The Owner's Box After Dark. Well, when you got the equipment, you got to use it, right? Okay, thanks again for joining us. We'll have another episode soon, and then we'll also have more Mansfield memories coming to you. So long, everyone.